She didn't need a knife or a gun, just a smile, a prayer, and a slow, silent poison. Velma Barfield looked like the perfect grandmother, but she was a cold-blooded serial killer who watched her victims die in agony. How did she get away with murder for over a decade? The house stood in ruins, engulfed by thick smoke and the acrid scent of charred wood. Flames had devoured everything, reducing the structure to little more than a skeletal frame. In the midst of the smouldering remains lay a body, burnt beyond recognition. That body belonged to Thomas Burke. Neighbors gathered around, their faces marked with sorrow, murmuring condolences for Velma Barfield, the grieving widow who had just lost her husband in a terrible accident. She stood among them, trembling, tears streaming down her cheeks, her frail figure evoking sympathy from those around her. Few could have imagined that behind this delicate appearance lay something far more sinister. There was no sign of foul play, no evidence pointing to a crime. The fire seemed like a tragic accident, another cruel twist of fate in Velma's unfortunate life. But that assumption was a grave mistake. It was not an accident. It was the first step in a carefully orchestrated series of murders that would span more than a decade. Velma had learned early on that deception was her greatest weapon. She knew how to manipulate emotions, how to appear as a victim while concealing the truth. Those who looked at her saw only a soft-spoken woman, a churchgoer, a devoted mother. They did not see the monster lurking beneath. Her childhood, as she later claimed, had been marked by abuse. She accused her father of mistreatment, of cruelty that shaped the darkness inside her. But whether these claims were true, or simply a desperate attempt to shift blame, remains uncertain. What is certain is that by the time she reached adulthood, Velma had developed an uncanny ability to feign innocence while committing acts of unimaginable cruelty. At 17, she married Thomas Burke, hoping to escape the horrors of her past. Their life together started peacefully in North Carolina, but beneath the surface, trouble brewed. Velma underwent a hysterectomy, a procedure that left her in chronic pain. She turned to prescription medication for relief, and soon, addiction took hold. Her dependence on pills consumed her, altering her behavior, making her erratic, unpredictable. Meanwhile, Thomas found solace in alcohol. Their home became a battlefield of arguments and resentment. Nights were filled with shouting matches, broken bottles, and the bitter stench of whiskey. Then, one fateful night, the fire erupted. Velma and the children had conveniently left the house, leaving Thomas alone in his drunken stupor. By the time they returned, the fire had already consumed everything. The authorities saw no reason to investigate further. Another unfortunate accident, another cruel twist of fate for a woman already burdened by misfortune. But something didn't add up. The flames had spread too quickly. The intensity of the fire suggested an accelerant, yet no one questioned it. Thomas's death was ruled as an accident, and Velma walked away untouched. If this had been an isolated incident, perhaps no one would have suspected her. But Thomas Burke was only the beginning. The flames had not only burned down the house, but had also erased all suspicion, allowing Velma to refine her methods, to evolve into something even more dangerous. A few months later, she remarried. Jennings Barfield, a widower with children of his own, became her next husband. To those who knew them, they seemed like a couple, given a second chance at love. But in reality, Velma was already spiraling further into her addiction. Jennings soon realized that his wife's dependence on medication was far worse than he had imagined. Arguments erupted over her constant use of pills, the way she manipulated prescriptions to get more. He threatened to leave, to end the marriage, but before he could take action, he fell ill. It started subtly: stomach pain, nausea, weakness, symptoms that resembled a simple case of food poisoning. But as the days passed, his condition deteriorated rapidly. He suffered intense vomiting, uncontrollable spasms, and unbearable pain. Velma remained by his side, offering comfort, whispering reassurances. She played the role of the devoted wife flawlessly. On March 22nd, 1971, less than a year after their marriage, Jennings succumbed to what was officially ruled as heart failure. Once again, Velma was a widow. Once again, tragedy had struck her life. But something far more chilling was happening. Every person who got too close to Velma seemed to meet an untimely end. One by one, they fell victim to a silent, invisible killer. And yet no one suspected her. Not yet. After the death of Jennings Barfield, Velma returned to live with her aging parents. The small town of North Carolina embraced her as a grieving widow, a woman burdened with an endless string of misfortunes. But misfortune had nothing to do with what followed. Her father died first, a slow and agonizing death attributed to lung cancer. There was nothing suspicious about it. A man in his late 60s, already ill, simply lost his battle with disease. But 2 years later, Velma's mother, Lillian Bullard, suddenly fell sick with an unknown ailment. At first, it seemed like a simple case of stomach flu, nausea, cramps, and vomiting. Yet her condition worsened rapidly. Within days, she was too weak to move, her body ravaged by relentless pain. By the time she was admitted to the hospital, doctors could do nothing. She died soon after, another victim claimed by an inexplicable illness. To those around her, Velma remained a woman cursed by tragedy. The deaths followed her like shadows, yet no one dared to question why. She was a woman of faith, devoted to God, finding solace in the words of the Bible. It was impossible to believe that she, of all people, could be responsible for so much death. With her parents gone, Velma turned to new ways of sustaining herself. Her addiction to prescription drugs had reached dangerous levels. She needed money, and she needed it quickly. That was when she discovered a new way to fund her habit, forging checks under the names of those she cared for. She took on the role of a caregiver, tending to elderly couples who needed help with daily tasks. The job was perfect. It gave her access to their finances, their trust, and most importantly, their food and medicine. Montgomery Edwards, a frail man in his 90s, was her next victim. Not long after Velma began working for him, he started exhibiting symptoms eerily similar to those of her mother: vomiting, stomach cramps, fatigue. The pain escalated until his body could take no more. His wife, Dolly Edwards, followed soon after. No one suspected Velma. She repeated the pattern with John Henry Lee, another elderly man under her care. By this point, she had perfected her method. She knew exactly how much poison to use, how to administer it gradually, how to ensure her victims' deaths appeared natural. John Henry Lee died of what was assumed to be a heart attack, and once again, Velma emerged unscathed. She was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a woman who had discovered the power of life and death, a woman who could take away a human existence without a single drop of blood being spilled. Her victims suffered in silence, unaware that the person they trusted most was the one tightening the noose around their necks. For years, Velma played her role flawlessly. She moved from house to house, leaving behind nothing but graves and unanswered questions. She was methodical, patient. Her victims never saw her coming, but every killer makes a mistake. Velma's came in the form of Stuart Taylor. Unlike her previous victims, Stuart was not an elderly man in declining health. He was in his mid-50s, a strong and independent individual. He and Velma had been in a relationship for some time, and they had even discussed marriage. But Stuart had something Velma feared: awareness. He was beginning to notice inconsistencies in her behavior, unexplained financial transactions, forged checks. Velma knew she could not afford to let him uncover the truth. She did what she had always done. She prepared his food, laced his drinks, watched as the poison slowly took hold. One evening, they attended a church revival together. Stuart suddenly doubled over in pain, clutching his stomach. He excused himself, staggering outside while Velma remained inside, singing hymns with the congregation. By the time she went to check on him, he was lying in his truck, drenched in sweat, his face twisted in agony. She drove him home, pausing along the way as he vomited violently on the side of the road. The next morning, he was admitted to the hospital. His condition deteriorated rapidly. Doctors suspected alcohol poisoning, unaware that arsenic was the true culprit. But this time, Velma had made an error. Stuart's family was different. They refused to accept that a healthy man could suddenly drop dead without explanation. They demanded answers. And for the first time, someone questioned Velma's story. When the autopsy report came back, it confirmed what they feared. Stuart's body contained high levels of arsenic. His death was not natural. He had been poisoned. Velma's world, which had remained so carefully controlled, began to collapse. Investigators looked into her past, tracing the pattern of deaths that followed her. They exhumed bodies, conducted new autopsies, and found the same damning evidence: arsenic hidden within the remains of her victims. For years she had been a phantom, slipping through the cracks of suspicion, using faith and deception as her shields. But now her secrets were exposed. The truth was undeniable. Velma Barfield was a serial killer. She had spent over a decade poisoning those closest to her, watching as they withered away while she played the role of the heartbroken survivor. She had manipulated emotions, woven a tapestry of lies so intricate that no one had ever dared to unravel it. But that was over now. The law had caught up to her, and this time there would be no escape. The courtroom was silent as the judge took his seat, the weight of the case hanging heavy in the air. The woman at the center of it all sat with an air of feigned calmness, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face the picture of meekness. Velma Barfield, the gentle-looking, church-going widow, was now the accused, charged with the systematic poisoning of those closest to her. What had once been whispered suspicions had now become undeniable truth. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. The bodies exhumed from the ground told the story Velma had tried to bury. Arsenic, found in lethal quantities, had seeped into their bones, preserved as a silent testament to the cruelty inflicted upon them. Her past, once thought to be riddled with misfortunes, was now seen for what it truly was: a carefully constructed illusion. Each victim had suffered the same fate: the slow, agonizing destruction of their body as the poison took hold, shutting down their organs, rendering them helpless. Each time, Velma had stood by their side, watching their suffering, pretending to care, whispering words of comfort, while knowing that their pain was caused by her own hand. Prosecutors laid out the facts in a chillingly methodical manner. The forged checks, the addiction-fueled motives, the deadly pattern that had gone unnoticed for so long. But what disturbed the jury the most was not just the murders themselves. It was the cold-blooded way in which Velma had carried them out. There was no anger in her crimes, no fits of passion, no moments of uncontrollable rage. Her killings were slow, deliberate, calculated. She did not strike in a moment of madness. She watched. She waited. She administered the poison in doses that prolonged suffering, ensuring that death came not as a sudden act of violence, but as an excruciating, drawn-out process. This was not the work of someone who had lost control. This was the work of someone who relished control. Psychologists struggled to categorize her. She did not fit the mold of a typical serial killer. There was no sexual component to her crimes, no signs of sadism in the traditional sense. Instead, she killed out of necessity. At least, that was what she wanted people to believe. She needed money. She needed to avoid exposure. But those explanations only scratched the surface. Beneath it all, there was something far more disturbing. Velma killed because she could, because she had found a method so insidious, so undetectable for years, that she had become addicted to it. The act of poisoning, of watching someone deteriorate under her control, had become as much a part of her as the pills she swallowed each day. She played the role of the victim until the very end. She wept. She spoke of her faith. She painted herself as a woman who had lost her way due to addiction. But the jury saw through it. They saw through the rehearsed sorrow, the carefully crafted image of a remorseful sinner. She was convicted of first-degree murder for the killing of Stuart Taylor. Though she had confessed to multiple murders, the prosecution focused on this single case. One was all they needed to secure the ultimate sentence. Velma was sentenced to death in December 1978, becoming the first woman in the United States to receive the death penalty after the practice was reinstated in 1976. The verdict sent shockwaves through the nation. The idea of a female serial killer, one who had hidden behind the guise of kindness and faith, was almost too grotesque to comprehend. Yet there she was, sitting in her prison cell, still playing the same role. While awaiting execution, Velma gained an unsettling amount of support from those who opposed the death penalty. They saw her as a changed woman, a repentant soul who had found redemption in God. Letters poured in, pleading for clemency. But those who had lost their loved ones to her deception remained steadfast. They had seen the way their family members suffered, writhing in pain, unable to understand why their bodies were failing them. They did not believe in Velma's redemption. They believed in justice. On November 2nd, 1984, Velma Barfield was led into the execution chamber at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. She had requested a simple last meal, a can of Coca-Cola and a bag of cheese doodles. It was an unremarkable choice, a stark contrast to the horrifying crimes that had led her to this moment. As the execution team prepared the lethal injection, Velma remained calm. No final protests, no pleas for mercy. She simply closed her eyes, exhaled, and let the poison enter her veins. The irony was lost on no one. Outside the prison walls, two groups had gathered. One side held candles, murmuring prayers, advocating for the abolition of capital punishment. The other stood in silent resolve, representing the families who had waited years for this day. When the announcement came that Velma Barfield was officially dead, there was no applause, no celebration, only quiet finality. The case of Velma Barfield remains one of the most disturbing examples of manipulation and murder in modern American history. She did not kill out of hatred. She did not kill in the heat of the moment. She killed as a means of survival, and in doing so, she proved herself to be one of the most cold-blooded murderers ever to walk free for as long as she did. But like all killers, her time ran out, and in the end, the poisoner met her own poison. Velma Barfield's story is a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always come with a menacing face. Sometimes it hides behind a warm smile, a soft voice, and a gentle touch. Her crimes shocked a nation, but her case raises deeper questions. Was she truly a victim of addiction, or was she a master manipulator who thrived on deception? What do you think? Was Velma driven by desperation, or was she always a killer at heart? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into true crime, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a case as chilling as this one. Stay safe, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next video.